think we'll go ahead and get started then. Hi, thank you for joining us. My name is Elizabeth Hagedorn. I'm the State Department correspondent at Al Monitor, and I'm thrilled to be here today with Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs, Barbara Leaf. As many of you know, her distinguished career as a diplomat includes serving as U.S. Ambassador to the United Arab Emirates, as well as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the Arabian Peninsula and Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Iraq. Other postings brought her to Cairo, Tunis, and Jerusalem. She also more recently served as Senior Director for the Middle East and North Africa at the NSC. Assistant Secretary, thank you so much for being here. It's good to be chatting outside the Beltway.
It certainly is, and I'm delighted to do it.
All right, well, let's start with the news of the week. Following the prisoner exchange, what are you looking to accomplish next with Iran? How likely is it that we see a resumption of formal nuclear talks?
Well, Elizabeth, first let me say just a word about the return of our fellow Americans. And this has been a quest for 15 or 16 months. And it's been an all-team, all-agency effort by the U.S. government. And it really goes back to a fundamental priority of the Biden administration, which is to bring our Americans home, our Americans who are unjustly detained overseas and who have suffered, many of them, for years in the darkness without contact with their families and loved ones. So it was really a joyful moment this week when we heard that the plane was wheels up in Doha. And I have to just reiterate what the President and the Secretary said. We gave heartfelt thanks to the governments of Switzerland, Qatar, Oman, the UK, South Korea, who really assisted us. Now, having gotten our fellow Americans back home, I would say that as concerns the nuclear dimension of the challenges, the myriad challenges that Iran presents us globally, I don't have any news to break for you. We had a long and protracted and very serious-minded effort on the part of the administration over the course of 2021, 2022. It ended with the Iranians essentially not able to pick up the deal that they had negotiated. So the fundamentals haven't changed in that regard. I don't have any news to break on something new or different coming along the way. And as far as the chatter out there that there is some sort of deal or in the offing, there really isn't. But the president has been clear on two counts that he does believe that the best way to deal with the nuclear dimension of Iran's threats is through diplomacy. And on the other hand, he has no intention of permitting Iran to develop a nuclear weapon.
I'd like to touch on some of the criticism surrounding the deal on the unfreezing of funds concerned. How would the administration respond were evidence to later emerge that Iran somehow engaged in deceptive financial practices that weren't caught by Treasury?
So look, these are Iranian funds. I think that's the first thing to underline. There are no U.S. taxpayer or U.S. funds that went into the mix. These are Iranian funds that were being held in South Korea. We have put together a set of ironclad, very restrictive arrangements with financial institutions in Qatar, where the money will be metered out for humanitarian purposes. So we have high confidence in those arrangements. These were funds that the previous administration had allowed Iran to accumulate in sequestered accounts by selling oil. And those funds will be used only for humanitarian purposes, food, medicine, and the like.
The administration has also faced some criticism for not securing the release of at least 2 U.S. residents in Iran, one of whom, Jamshid Sharmad, is on death row. At any point in the negotiations, did the administration seek the release of either of these men?
So I can't go into the details of what as I said, was a very long and arduous set of negotiations, protracted negotiations, and assisted by, as I said, Qatar in large part. We have an unrelenting quest to help Americans, including legal permanent residents who have longstanding ties to the U.S., to get home. It is not always possible to get everyone home at the same time, unfortunately.
I'd like to turn to Israel and Saudi Arabia. Normalizing relations between those two countries is a top foreign policy priority of this administration. But Why such a focus on normalization between those two countries when it seems neither has demonstrated much willingness to make concessions on issues such as Israel's tech cooperation with China or Saudi Arabia's record on human rights and political repression?
So first, let me just rearrange what you just said. I would frame it in a different way. Yes, the Biden administration is putting a lot of effort into the quest to foster, to midwife, normalized relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel. But it's at the request of those two countries. It is not a sort of a singular offside desire of the U.S. alone, but rather of those two countries. The road will be long and winding. It is long and winding, and it will be very complex to get there. But we believe fundamentally that it has strategic value for the U.S., for Saudi Arabia, for Israel, but more broadly for the region. The various issues we have bilaterally with both of those governments, we continue to work. But they're not, they need not be the impediment to trying to do the good work of resetting things. And let me just add, you didn't mention the Palestinians. The Palestinians, we believe, will figure in the mix of this very complex geometry. And that is a good thing for the Palestinians as well.
I'd like to turn to the Palestinians in a bit here, but I've heard administration officials refer to a potential normalization agreement between Saudi Arabia and Israel as in the U.S. national security interest. Can you elaborate a bit more on that?
So look, I'll go back to the opening moments of the administration in January 2021 when, as you mentioned, I started my time with the administration in the White House at the NSC. And as my colleague, Brett McGurk, the senior coordinator for the Middle East, North Africa, and I sat down and sort of surveyed the region, we had both been out of government for a couple of years. We found really the region in a state of just extraordinary fragility, extraordinary tension and pressure. And there were sort of seeping wounds, if you will, in terms of three chronic conflicts, one very hot, Yemen, Libya, hot on and off, Syria receding a bit in terms of the actual conflict, but still very unstable, and then countries like Lebanon in an advanced state of decay, frankly. So, but there was a broader sense of the rifts of the previous 5 or 6 years had really brought in a terrific amount of tension and stress points in the region, and that was very much magnified by Iran's activities. So we set upon a course of de-escalation in the first instance, setting ourselves to the task of trying to work on the conflicts, to bring them to a pause, to a halt, to resolve them. And so beyond that, as the president framed his visit continuously last summer to the region, we began to look at something even more affirmative, which is regional integration. So seeing some of those rifts begin to heal, principally within the Gulf family between certain Gulf countries and Egypt and Turkey and so on. As those rifts began to heal, we found that we could get to some really important work, again, towards integration, because it is one of the least integrated regions in the world in economic terms. And I'm not talking about Israel-Arab integration alone, but rather if you go through the landscape, you find a tremendous lack of connectivity from country to country in trade terms and cooperation of various types, security and others. So integration is good for the United States in terms of our engagements with partners. If you have much like Europe, if you've been able to foster a spirit of cooperativeness, including across lines that are 70 years old, that have impeded cooperation on climate, on security, on food security. It's a great thing. It's a good thing for the U.S. It's a good thing for the region.
You mentioned the Palestinians. This administration continues to promote the two-state solution to resolving that conflict, but that framework for peace seems as distant as ever under Netanyahu's right-wing government and a weakened Palestinian Authority. I'm wondering, do you see normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia then as the best hope of securing concessions for the Palestinians this time?
So, look, this has been a long-running trend. We haven't seen negotiations of any kind since 2014. And there was a real sort of withering and diminishment and really cessation of almost any kind of relationship between successive Israeli governments and the Palestinian Authority. And frankly, in the last administration, that also occurred between the U.S. and the PA. So you're right, it's a very daunting prospect at this point, and I think the Secretary has put it pretty clearly that, when we look at the prospects for Palestinian statehood, for two states living side by side in equal measures of security and peace and prosperity, it's a much diminished prospect, and yet it is still something that we regard as fundamental to Palestinian desires, to their rights to forge their own future, but it's also fundamental to Israeli security. So the normalization piece is an opportunity that we have picked up, and given the desire of both countries for us to try this. It needn't be the only way this comes about, but we think it can be a galvanizing point.
Well, what are those other ways then? Because I think there has been some criticism of this administration for not using what leverage it has with the Israelis when it comes to settlement expansion, or some of the extreme rhetoric we're seeing from members of Netanyahu's cabinet.
So look, fundamentally, it comes down to negotiations. It comes down to political negotiations. The conditions have been non-existent for some years for all the reasons that we know. And it's not one government, but a succession of factors, succession of governments. There's plenty of blame to be apportioned to the Palestinian side as well. But ultimately, a state will come about through negotiations, and that's what we will support. We didn't come into office with a peace plan to impose on the parties, and the conditions were completely non-existent. And we have worked assiduously at fostering connectivity between the PA and the Israeli government, or series of governments. And we have also now more recently been, with Egypt and Jordan, engaged in an effort to bring about a greater stability on the West Bank and stability to the Palestinian Authority. That doesn't take the place of what has to come, which is ultimately political negotiations.
I want to turn now to Syria. Many U.S. partners in the Middle East are taking steps to bring Bashar al-Assad back into the diplomatic fold. It seems there is a perception in some Middle East capitals that while the U.S. doesn't support normalization, it's not going to do anything to prevent it. Is that a fair assessment?
So I think I got a certain amount of criticism for something I said at the last time I appeared on the stage at El Monitor, but let me just clarify for the record. There are all sorts of misapprehensions out in various places in the Middle East, and some of it is maybe wishful thinking on the part of the Assad regime itself. We don't believe normalization will bring about the change that is critical on the part of Damascus, on the part of the regime itself. And we have been in a regular dialogue with a host of Arab partners about their different efforts, and now efforts that are going to be collected up and focused together through the Arab Contact Group of the Arab League. We speak regularly. I think we have exactly the same ultimate desire in the end in terms of regime behavior change, starting with the very fundamentals under 2254 that concerns humanitarian access, safe and secure return of refugees, the ability of Syrians to live free of repression and molestation by the regime. There are host accountability for the missing, those who disappeared into Assad's jails a decade ago. I hear a lot of frustration from our Arab partners that the regime is simply picked up on, happily took up the readmission to the Arab League, but has really done very little in the meantime to address these issues, and issues that go directly to the security of the neighbors, most especially Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, but also to the broader region in terms of the Captagon trade, in terms of the insecurity that the regime has essentially exported. So, it is one way of trying to get at the same thing that we're trying to get at, but let me be clear, we don't intend to normalize. We don't see any value to it, and we will pursue the approach that we have to date, which is working to ensure that the ceasefire lines stay cold in the country, that those who are outside regime control can foster their own lives, their own economic livelihood. We will certainly work with our Arab partners, and we will give our input into their process, but it's a very different approach.
Just last week, the U.S. said it would be withholding some, but not all, of the military aid to Egypt that Congress had conditioned on human rights reforms. And critics, each year when this has happened, critics have said, including many in the president's own party, that this is another example of the administration not centering human rights in its foreign policy as promised. How do you respond to that criticism, not just with Egypt, but also with Saudi Arabia and with some other Middle East countries for whom the U.S. has to balance strategic interests, but also uphold this pledge of a rights-based foreign policy?
Look, I will just say, as a diplomat who literally in every single job during my career, I've advocated on behalf of democratic values, on human rights, both the principles but also specific cases. There is always a tension, a very clear tension in the work that we do across the region with all of our partners. We have a human rights dialogue across the region, whether these are close friends or simply countries that we engage with on a variety of issues. But that dialogue, that effort, is at the center point of every relationship in this region. It doesn't mean that we can produce results every day. It's a long slog. It's labor intensive. You go back and back in advocacy and work on specific cases as well as larger principles or getting governments to effectuate changes in their legislation. It is labor intensive. The work is never done, but it is part and parcel of every single relationship we have in this region.
On Egypt specifically, does it send the wrong message that the U.S. is essentially sending more money this year when they're, by administration officials' own account, not the progress that you wanted to see on human rights?
The work is going to continue. The work continues even as the Secretary made a very carefully thought through evaluation of certain national security priorities, contributions that Egypt was making and will continue to make on some key asks. But at the same time, he declined to waive the $85 million on which were conditioned funds that were conditioned strictly on human rights progress. So this work will continue.
We have a little bit of time left, so I want to finish up with Yemen. This ending the war there was a foreign policy priority early for this administration. Recently, we saw the Houthis make a rare trip to Saudi Arabia for ceasefire talks. So there does appear to be momentum on the Houthi-Saudi track. But in order to end what is a multifaceted, much wider conflict, do Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates need to be on better terms?
So look, you're absolutely right that there is a sense of momentum being gained. I don't want to sound giddy with optimism because, of course, ending such a protracted, complex civil war conflict is extraordinarily difficult. There are as many setbacks as there are points of progress. But I will say we felt very gratified by the news, and we'd heard it colleagues and I, when we were in Riyadh 10 days ago, the Saudi leadership was keenly awaiting the arrival of the delegation. They thought it was a very important moment. There had not been such a visit in 4 years. It is a reflection of movement, but the game is not done. The fact that we have 18 months, more or less now, of an informal ceasefire is remarkable stuff when you consider how things looked 2 years, almost 3 years ago. That's been the hard slog that the Saudis, the Omanis, and others have contributed to making progress on. So it is very encouraging. The Secretary had the opportunity, the Secretary and I and Tim Linderking, our special envoy on Yemen, had an opportunity last evening to sit down with Sheikh Abdullah and Prince Faisal and their teams and really kind of lay things out and evaluate where things were going. Yes, measured optimism at this certain juncture, but a recognition by all three of us that there was a lot of work to be done, and some of the most important work would be on coordinating our approach to maximize our collective and individual influence on the parties, because there's the Saudi Houthi piece, and then there's the Yemeni piece. The PLC has to go into the negotiations with a strong and united stance. There has to be a pivot point where the UN Special Envoy will take up his mission. So there's still a long way ahead, but I think we're in a very good place with our Saudi and Emirati partners to give energy to this good momentum.
Okay, and with that, I'm afraid we are about out of time. Assistant Secretary Lee, thank you so much for taking time out of what is a very hectic schedule. I'm sure we really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.